Hi, I'm Jan, and this video is about how I built an AI chatbot that can build a financial plan for you. It combines the precision of an Excel sheet with the natural friendliness of ChatGPT. I will talk about how I built it and why I built it. However, this is not a product demo or a coding tutorial. Instead, I want to tell the story of what it's like to create and build a product in 2024 from the perspective of someone who has never built a product or used any modern web technologies like React or Next.js, Vercel or Shadcn CN UI. But because of generative AI, that door was suddenly open. I will talk about mistakes and learnings, pivots, frustrations, and user feedback. So get ready. Feel free to skip to these chapters if you only are interested in the technical aspects of building this product. However, I think this video only makes sense if you know a bit more about myself. I was a web developer or web designer for my entire adult life. As a teenager, I designed and built the website of my online gaming clan, and I loved how everybody could just access it from everywhere in the world. After becoming a certified media designer, I became a freelancer and I built websites for clients ever since 2013. I remember that time was also when web development became more like professional software engineering. Command line tools like NPM or Gulp and libraries like React or Angular replaced the beloved jQuery. At the time, there was this common joke among web developers that you had to learn a new framework every 6 months just to catch up. At some point, I must have tried out all of these tools, but I always felt like they were designed to solve problems that Facebook or Google had, not the problems that I had. They were definitely not made for people who just wanted to put something on the internet. There were people at the time who pointed out that the accessible and open spirit of the web suffered, and single-page apps caused longer loading times and issues with SEO and accessibility.
If you make a website that relies on JavaScript, that if you were to view source would have no HTML because everything is injected by JavaScript, there's a number of frameworks out there these days that are encouraging this behavior, that website now immediately has a single point of failure.
My client work moved more towards server-side applications, like connecting a WordPress installation with a CRM database, for example, using REST APIs. I always remained open towards the possibility of trying out a modern web framework for the next project. But that project never came. With the growing complexity of these frameworks, more and more projects had requirements like 3 years of React Redux or whatever. And so I was in this chicken and egg situation. I need experience to get work, but I need work to get experience, if that makes sense. Here's something honest I have to tell you about me. I'm not the greatest in memorizing things like API endpoints and framework methods. I would be lost without autocomplete and code snippets. I always enjoyed the decision-making and problem-solving more than the actual typing of code into an editor or setting up a server and so on. You can perhaps see how I would struggle in the early stages of an interview where it's about years of experience to even get invited to a coding interview. And then in the coding interview, it's like very basic things like sort this array or whatever. And ultimately all of that for a job that only required maybe 2 or 3 out of the 10 different skill sets that I learned as a freelancer. In 2018, at 29, I decided I needed a change in my career. So I decided, for the first time in my life, I'm going to go to university to study business and economics. The idea was to eventually become maybe a manager of engineers or maybe launch a product of my own so that I could focus on what I enjoyed most, problem solving, finding creative solutions, but leave the implementation to others. Fast forward to early 2023, and I'm now COO and project manager at a fintech startup. And it's my dream job because it combines my background in tech and my knowledge of business. But it's also the year in which ChatGPT and GitHub Copilot take off. And in my free time, I experiment with these tools. And I realized that suddenly, during a weekend, I can realize ideas that I never could do before, like write a Python command line script to help me sort my music library, or write a Vercel serverless function to automatically summarize my reading list. ChatGPT presented me with a list of options, and given my experience, although I had never used those options, I knew which one would probably be the right one to get the job done. So then GitHub Copilot helped me implement those into code. Suddenly, the gap between having an idea and realizing it became 10 times smaller. I felt that magic spark again, like when I was a teenager and I could just turn ideas into a website. I felt like I was ready for web development again, and I decided to build something. I wanted it to be something that could eventually become its own product, so that it would fund more iterations, or at least pay for the hosting costs. It should also be something that would be an excuse to learn some of the most modern state-of-the-art technologies like Vercel or Next.js. And even if it wouldn't become a huge success, it would still be a showcase of my talents and maybe help me attract some more work. I went with React, not because it's flawless and universally loved, but because it's safe to say at this point that it won the battle of the frameworks. There aren't that many groundbreaking new changes since React hooks were introduced in 2019. And while some have criticized that, for me it was actually an advantage, because it meant that React had reached a certain level of maturity and stability, and there were plenty of resources online to learn. And because large language models are trained on the open internet, that means the more something is used, the more likely it is an LLM can help you. These days, React heavily nudges you towards using Next.js, using its Create React app. And so that's what I used. Even though I didn't exactly know what Next was at this point, I only later learned that the CEO of the company behind it actually wrote a blog article where he criticized some of the shortcomings of single-page applications, which I read at the time and agreed with a lot. So that's cool. I, of course, asked ChatGPT for other options and made sure that I understand the pros and cons of going with this decision. I even considered building an iOS app using Swift UI, but the learning curve for that would have been even steeper, not to mention that I prefer the open nature of the web. I think it's important to know one's own limitations, and even though ChatGPT and GitHub Copilot can make you feel like you're 10 times more productive, you will still run into limitations eventually. And then ChatGPT can't help you either. Remember to have fun, that's what I told myself, and had to remind myself a couple of times. For the product itself, I wanted to build a financial planner, which didn't feel like an Excel sheet or a form built in the 1990s that you had to fill out. I thought, what if financial planning felt more like a video game or a movie editor with drag and drop, where rather than changing the inputs, you would change the output that you wanted, and then the program would calculate how much you would have to save to achieve that goal. And it should support multiple goals at once, so that you could not only say, I want to retire in 30 years, but also, I want to buy a new computer in 2 years, for example. Or I'm expecting an inheritance in 10 years. I needed a financial model that was complex enough to support all these variables, but also fast enough so that it could feel intuitive and fun to use. And everything became a lot more complex when I decided to add growing monthly investments and taxes. This was already pretty much at the limit of my own math skills. But ChatGPT tutored me and pushed me towards my own limitations. It was always friendly and optimistic. I felt like I wasn't alone with this problem and instead had a partner who was pushing me. So I didn't give up. For example, I gave it this very long, complicated math term that has all these variables in it to calculate the future value of the investment, and asked it to rearrange it for one variable. And it would just rearrange all these complex terms quickly without a mistake. It felt surreal, as if you had your own private university math tutor. Back to the financial planner. Once the math seemed right, I just asked it to convert it to JavaScript so I could use it in my project. It used TensorFlow, which you might have heard of because it's used in machine learning, but it's not the obvious choice in an app like this. However, it does have some advantages. For example, it makes the code look more like the math formula. For example, taxes. Well, that's just all the profits times the interest rate. What are profits? It's just the compounded investments minus the initial investments. It makes it easier to look at the code months later and still kind of understand what's going on here. I built a first very simple prototype in React where I was just trying out the math to create a chart using Chart.js. I chose Chart.js because it seemed like it had the most powerful API to make customizations, to make the chart behave and be interactive just the way I wanted it. Plus, it has a very rich ecosystem of already existing examples and plugins to save some time. Here, ChatGPT helped me again because I had already worked through the official learning resources on react.dev, but there were some nuances which I didn't understand really, when to use which hook at what time, what are the differences. So I asked ChatGPT to create me some sort of playground where rather than learning one hook at a time, it would just add all of them in one file and I could use it interactively, play around with it, and that really helped me to understand the nuances of these concepts. It was exactly what I needed at that time, and it's nothing that exists on the web. It helped me bridge that gap between the documentation and the real-world application. Remember, this is the first time I ever built a React application. I think it's fantastic that this is possible now. I was excited to demo this to friends and get feedback, but then this happened.
Good morning. Welcome to our first ever OpenAI Dev Day.
And I'd like to highlight one of my favorite features here, function calling. If you have not used it yet, function calling is really powerful. And as Sam mentioned, we're taking it a step further today. So here, if I carry on and say, hey, what are the top 10 things to do? We're going to have the assistant respond to that again. And here, what's interesting is that the assistant knows about functions, including those to annotate the map that you see on the right. And so now all of these pins are dropping in real time here. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
I saw this and thought, well, drag and drop is cool, but wouldn't it be even cooler to be able to use natural language to say, I have this many savings and I wonder when I can retire? And it would tell you the answer and draw a nice graph. So I rather hastily integrated a basic chatbot into the prototype that I had. And I was very lucky that there is this template on GitHub, which is actually built by the guys behind Vercel and Next. This video would be 2 or 3 times as long as it is if I went into the details of this template and the AI SDK. I encourage you to check it out yourself if you're interested in building a chatbot, if you haven't already. For me, it was perfect because it came already set up with all of the latest technologies like Next.js app router and server actions, or Shadcn that uses TailwindCSS and Redux UI. I should mention everything comes at a price, and this template definitely nudges you towards using a Vercel Pro plan if you actually want to deploy it. But there is a fork that uses Supabase, which is a bit cheaper if you prefer to go that route. At this point, I was still torn between building a drag and drop based financial calculator with advanced features that even pros might find useful, and building a beginner-friendly chat-based assistant. While it's no doubt exciting to work at the cutting edge of technology and using things like streaming UI or chatbots, it also means that you're using things still in development and not completely finished. And a lot of things at the core of your application are behind scary sounding methods like experimental something, things that can change in the future and even break your application. But then the feedback I got from friends overwhelmingly suggested that I build a chatbot. Of course, AI is the hot thing, everybody talks about it. It's way easier to convince people to try out some product that's now AI-based than something that could have basically existed 10 years ago already. So the nerdy drag-and-drop Excel killer app had to wait, at least for now. Okay, so I have the calculator on the right, the chat on the left, and it's clear the calculator has to become way simpler and more provide an overview, like when you talk to a real human financial advisor and he or she takes out a piece of paper and writes down your age and your basic information, and you can see that, but it's not like at the center of the conversation. The chat could only call one single function to change one input from the calculator. And the code base is now this Frankenstein monster of code which came with the template, but that I rewrote using ChatGPT and GitHub Copilot using my beginner React skills. It's all crammed into one big JSX file. Some parts of the code base is written in TypeScript, which I don't understand and I can barely decipher using GitHub Copilot. It all barely works, but based on the feedback that I got, I'm now motivated to make this into a product that people are willing to use and even pay money for. So I spent an entire week only focusing on cleaning up the code base and making sure I understand everything that's going on, so that I feel like I'm on top of this and I'm confident of building more on top of this. Throughout this project, I found myself in this nice rhythm where I would build something that barely works, just enough to test it and see if the idea makes sense at all. And then when it does, iterate and clean it up and make sure it works rock solid. And then, and only then, move on to the next thing. And the modern development stack really encourages this. This is maybe one of the biggest changes to how I used to work. I can very quickly make changes to the UI, which, thanks to Shadcn, almost always looks fantastic out of the box with very little changes. And then, thanks to hot reloading and some beta features like TurboPack, everything is super fast. It feels like writing CSS in live preview in good old Espresso, if anybody remembers that. But if I want to deploy it to production on Vercel, I need to pass the build and deployment process and fix all those TypeScript errors. That can sometimes feel frustrating and limiting, but ultimately it's worth it because it makes me more confident in the code that I'm writing. In the end, I even added a playwright test that automatically runs whenever I push code to GitHub and that uses the free Vercel preview environments for testing. I still have way too many type any statements and the test coverage is not nearly exhaustive enough. But it's enough to protect me from really stupid mistakes where I think I'm just making a tiny little change here in this part of the app, but I miss that it's a dependency that causes the app to break in production. That would never happen to me, just making sure, of course. The headline of this video is that AI code generation is amazing, but also that modern web development has become really fun and liberating, for the most part. Fast forward, and now I have what I would call a minimum viable product that shows the essence of my idea. The chat on the left can call any function that's necessary to update the inputs for the calculator, like retirement age, monthly investments, interest rate, tax model. I also added a basic solver so that it can calculate an optimized input in order to achieve any outcome, like how much one has to save every month in order to retire at a certain age. The chat receives the current input and result of the calculation whenever the user sends a message. So you can just ask it, is this interest rate realistic? and it will tell you the answer based on the specific interest rate that's currently selected. It's as if you had an expert who already knows how to use the app and will just use it for you or make suggestions how you should use it. I also added a PDF download feature because I wanted people to take something from the experience and make them feel like they achieved something that they can now put into action. I had no personal experience launching a software as a service product, so I had no idea how much it would cost for the Vercel hosting or the usage from OpenAI. But I wanted people to try out the full app with all the features so they could try it out before they buy it. So I added a quota and IP rate limiting. I added Vercel's analytics and Microsoft Clarity so that I could learn from how users actually use the app. I care a lot about privacy, and since this is a product where users are potentially sharing very personal and sensitive information about themselves, I wanted to limit the amount of data I collect and share with third parties and be at least transparent about it. And last but not least, I added a branded landing page and a Dolly-generated little toad avatar. This was so important because it made the app feel more finished, professional, and approachable. You know, like a real product. I was ready to hit launch and announce my new chat assistant to the world, but then this happened.
ChatGPT just launched the GPT store.
OpenAI just released the long-awaited GPT store.
The GPT store is out now, and I'm going to cover everything.
Okay, so up until this point, I may have made it sound as if this was just a fun ride through AI paradise. But in actuality, I actually became close to being burned out at this point. See, I started with this project wanting it to last maybe a month, but then at this point I was already working on it for 3 months. And I started out of curiosity and excitement and maybe building something for myself that could get me a job. But then it became this thing where I felt like I had to launch a product that's going to be a big success. And I kept adding features to it to make it more likely to be a big success in my mind, but that weren't really necessary. Like the PDF download feature took an enormous and unreasonable amount of time, but really just wasn't necessary. Basically, because I felt 10 times more productive, I added 10 times more work to me. I had a big vacation with my girlfriend coming up that I had planned months ago. And I knew that if I would launch the product before the vacation, that I would be checking my emails and messages every day, every time to see if the server's still running, if the payment system is working, who's writing about it, and so on and so on. And that was just not acceptable for me. So I took a month off from this project and didn't work on it at all. And that was the right decision. I'm not going to lie, building this app was extremely rewarding and exciting, but it also took so much trial and error. There are things that ChatGPT and GitHub Copilot just cannot help you with, at least not today. Especially if you're like me and have very little experience building a product like this. So what's the verdict from all of this? Should we stop teaching how to code at all?
It is our job to create computing technology such that nobody has to program.
Code generating AI is the most exciting thing that I experienced ever since I discovered I could build websites as a teenager. And I think this excitement will keep going because now we will have more and more breakthroughs through AI. I think in the future, the minimum bar to create things is going to get lower and lower. We have already seen it in art, and I wouldn't be surprised if in a year or two, I could just enter, build me a financial advice chatbot that can create a financial plan into something like V0, and the result would be pretty close to what I just built over 3 months. However, I think knowing how things work on a deeper level is going to keep being useful for just coming up with an idea of what's possible and then tweaking this idea to what you want it to be like. Perhaps that's just how my mind works. For now, AI automates mostly the boring and tedious things which I don't like to do, and that gives me more time to work on interesting things. AIs are not yet fully equal coworkers, but more like interns who have memorized the documentation on day one and that need guidance and experience to be productive. Was this video helpful to you? Could I be replaced by ChatGPT? Let me know in the comments. I might make more videos like this or not. Doesn't hurt to subscribe. Most importantly, remember to have fun. Bye.